They said America was unguarded, that its forests were exposed, that its skies so far from the thunder of war in Europe and the Pacific were soft targets. Japan believed it had found the crack in America's armor. It was 1944, and while American bombers were torching Tokyo and rolling over Europe, Japan launched a different kind of weapon, one built on silence, wind, and shadows. 9,000 hydrogen balloons, each one a silent predator, each one carrying bombs, fuses, and the faint hope that fire would do what fleets and armies could not.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
These weren't guided missiles. They didn't need to be. They didn't roar or flash. They simply floated, high above the Pacific Ocean, 30,000 feet in the air, riding the jet stream. It took days for them to cross, days in which no American radar would detect them, no sirens would wail, no pilots would scramble. The plan was simple, terrifyingly so. Set fire to the American West, burn its timber, drain its manpower, force the government to pull troops and resources from the front lines to fight infernos at home. And more than that, make Americans afraid. Afraid that nowhere was safe. Afraid that even the vast, tranquil forests of Oregon and California could become war zones. For a while, it seemed like the plan might work. Balloons began falling. Some exploded. Some didn't. Some caused fires. Most were never seen. The government issued no alerts. Newspapers were ordered silent. This was a war of shadows, one America couldn't afford to acknowledge. But America did fight back, just not in the way Japan expected. Because the answer didn't come from an airbase or a naval fleet. It came from a battalion that almost didn't exist. A group of soldiers trained to jump into fire, who had been told over and over that they didn't belong. Black paratroopers, the first of their kind. The 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, the Triple Nickels. They were trained for Europe, trained to jump into combat zones, to deploy behind enemy lines. But America didn't send them to the Ardennes or the Rhine. Instead, it gave them a mission no one would ever talk about. No medals, no parades, just a fire, a forest, and silence. They were sent west not to fight Germans or Japanese soldiers, but to fight the very weapon those Japanese had sent riding the wind. Balloon bombs, incendiaries, unexploded ordnance hidden in the underbrush, fires that sparked miles from roads, in wilderness so remote it barely existed on maps. Their mission was classified. Even their families didn't know. They called it Operation Firefly. The 555th didn't just jump out of planes. They jumped into flames, into steep ravines, into dense forests, into terrain that didn't care how many push-ups you could do or how straight you stood in formation. Every jump was a gamble. Parachutes tangled in trees. Winds turned against you. Sometimes the fire got there first, but they jumped anyway. Over 1,000 times, they dropped from the sky. 5 states, dozens of fires, hundreds of near-death experiences. The flames weren't the only threat. Many of the bombs hadn't detonated. They lay buried, ticking silently in the soil, until a boot step or a gust of wind changed everything. One slip, one wrong move. That's all it took. And they were doing it all in a country that still didn't see them as equal. These were men who wore the uniform of a country that kept them segregated, who trained in separate camps, ate in separate mess halls, slept in separate barracks. Some commanders didn't want them. Some white officers believed black men couldn't be trusted with parachutes, too undisciplined, too weak, too afraid of heights. That's what the War Department had once written. The 555th proved them wrong. Again and again and again. They trained harder. They jumped farther. They learned to navigate without maps, to fight fire with shovel and axe, to carry each other out of blazes when men went down. They became America's first military smoke jumpers, not because they wanted to be, but because no one else could do what they did. They didn't need recognition. They needed a mission. And the mission was deadly. Some of those Japanese balloons did explode. In May 1945, one balloon landed near Bly, Oregon. A pastor's wife, Elsie Mitchell, and 5 children were on a church outing when they found it. Curious, they approached. The bomb detonated. They were all killed instantly. The only American civilians to die on the mainland during World War II. The news was censored. The military didn't want panic. Didn't want Japan to know their weapon had worked. But the 555th knew. They knew what they were up against. They knew that every balloon, every fire, every remote jump had the potential to turn fatal. Still, they jumped. And while the nation celebrated victories in Europe and mourned losses in the Pacific, The triple nickels saved lives quietly, without fanfare. They stopped fires before they reached towns, contained blazes that could have eaten entire counties. They risked their lives in silence for a war that didn't want to admit they were even fighting it. And then, it was over. The war ended. Japan surrendered. The balloon attacks stopped. The fires faded. The 555th was deactivated, absorbed into other units, scattered into history. No medals. No ticker tape. Just silence. For decades, their mission remained unknown. Their heroism classified, forgotten, buried beneath layers of red tape and racism. The story of the first black paratroopers, of the men who jumped into fire when their country wouldn't even let them sit at the same table, wasn't told. But silence doesn't last forever. Eventually, the records came out. The photos, the mission logs, the jump reports. Historians began piecing together what had happened in those forests, how a group of men changed the very nature of wildland firefighting, how they pioneered techniques still used today: direct attack, parachute deployment into fire zones, emergency medical response in wilderness areas. They weren't just heroes of war. They were inventors, innovators, trailblazers, and they did it all while wearing a patch stitched with 3 nickels, 1 for each 5 in their battalion number. The triple nickels, a symbol of strength, unity, and unspoken pride, because the fight wasn't just against fire. It was against invisibility. They fought a war that history didn't want to remember. But the truth is louder now. And it tells us something profound about how greatness often comes from the margins, how courage shows up in the quiet, in the missions no one wants, in the jobs no one sees. Japan believed America was vulnerable, that its forests were undefended, that it could slip in beneath the radar and ignite fear with nothing but hydrogen, fire, and wind. They never expected the response to come from a group of black paratroopers trained for another battlefield. But that's exactly what happened. And while the forests still burn, and balloon bombs rust in the soil, the legacy of the 555th lives on, not in the headlines of the past, but in the smoke jumpers of today. In every fire crew that drops from the sky to fight an inferno in the middle of nowhere. They follow a path carved by the triple nickels, carved in flame, in silence, in courage. You can almost imagine it now, those long days in the Oregon wilderness, the smoke so thick it stung your eyes before you even hit the ground. The hum of the C-47's engines above, the sudden quiet the second you jumped, and then the wind howling in your ears as the forest rushed up beneath your boots. For most Americans in 1945, that image never existed. These weren't stories told over dinner. No radio programs blared news of black soldiers battling flames set by an invisible enemy. And even if people had known, many wouldn't have cared. Because these weren't soldiers who fit the Hollywood war narrative. These weren't white men charging a beach in France or flying bombers over Berlin. These were black men falling from the sky into burning forests for a country that didn't even let them sit in the front of the bus. And that's what makes their story even more impossible to ignore. Because they still jumped. Every time. Even when the smoke rose high enough to black out the sun. Even when the landing zones were nothing but cliffs, tangled trees, and burning brush. Even when a misjudged wind gust meant smashing into a rock outcrop, or a twisted ankle meant crawling out of hell alone. You don't just do that for a paycheck. You don't do it for glory, especially when you know there won't be any. You do it because it has to be done. Because the fires won't stop. Because someone has to meet them head on, even if no one ever hears your name. The 555th was never given the chance to fight the war it trained for. No battle ribbons. No kill counts. No liberation stories. And yet they may have saved more American lives than most units that fired a single shot. Because wildfires don't negotiate. They don't retreat. They don't surrender. They just keep coming until someone stops them. And the balloon bombs. The very idea was terrifying in its simplicity. A Japanese engineer sat in a lab and figured out how to use the jet stream, an invisible river of air that most Americans hadn't even heard of yet, to deliver fire across an entire ocean. No planes. No ships. No warning. Just silence. And then, boom. By the time the government realized the threat, it was already falling into national forests. The very spine of the West, miles upon miles of ancient timber, dry from years of drought. Entire towns bordered these forests. One spark, one fire left unchecked, and everything could go up in smoke. And the fires came. They hit in Oregon, California, Montana, Idaho, Washington. Some never even made the papers. Others came close to towns, rail lines, even military supply routes. And always, the 555th got the call. Not because they were the first choice, but because no one else could do it fast enough. You didn't just need firefighters. You needed men who could jump into nowhere. They weren't trained for that in the beginning. They were trained to fight Nazis. They ran drills with rifles, not shovels. Their jumps were meant for behind enemy lines, not into infernos. But when the orders changed, they didn't hesitate. They adapted. Quickly, brutally, and without complaint. They learned how to hit and dig, drop into a fire zone, assess the blaze, and start cutting fire breaks before the main crew could even get boots on the ground. They packed parachutes laced with emergency gear, rolled fire-resistant rope over their shoulders, learned how to spot signs of underground embers that could flare back up without warning. They carried their wounded. They buried their dead. And every time they landed, they knew something else too. They were being watched, not by reporters, not by the public, but by an America waiting expecting them to fail. Every mistake they made would be used against them. Every stumble would confirm a prejudice. So they made fewer mistakes, took fewer chances, because for them, failure didn't just mean mission failure. It meant ammunition for every racist assumption that followed them into uniform. Still, they succeeded. The 555th completed more than 1,200 jumps in their brief time as a unit. Not one man was lost in combat. But injuries were constant: broken legs, concussions, burns, tree landings gone wrong. One man fell through the branches and was impaled on a broken limb. Another chute caught in a dead pine, snapping like tissue in the wind, dropping him 40 feet to the forest floor. But they kept jumping. The woods didn't care what color you were. Neither did the flames. But the country did. Even after the war, even after their records were slowly declassified, the 555th didn't get the hero's welcome. No national monuments, no medals pinned by the president. They were demobilized, scattered into the background of military history. The balloon bombs were buried in the public consciousness. Their story, like so many others, was left in the smoke. Decades later, pieces of the truth began to resurface. Veterans told their stories quietly, humbly. A few historians started asking questions. A few surviving members began attending reunions, telling their grandkids what really happened in those forests. And finally, slowly, the world started to listen. Not because the country had changed overnight, but because time has a way of revealing what pride and politics try to bury. And what emerged was this. The 555th was more than a military unit. They were a symbol of defiance, of duty, of a quiet, relentless excellence in the face of a nation that had given them every reason to walk away. And still, they jumped. They jumped into burning forests while the world looked elsewhere. They jumped while carrying the burden of two battles, one against fire, and one against a society that measured their worth by skin color, not skill. They jumped, not to be remembered, but because someone had to do the job. And now, all these years later, the echoes of their parachutes still fall across history. Every wildfire crew that rappels from a helicopter. Every smoke jumper who drops into the blaze to stop it from crossing that next ridgeline. Every fire shelter deployed in the heat, those are echoes of the triple nickels. Most of them are gone now. The men who carried that mission in silence. But their legacy, once invisible, is now becoming impossible to ignore. Their courage didn't just shape military firefighting, it challenged a country to reckon with the stories it didn't want to tell. The balloon bombs failed to ignite the panic Japan had hoped for. But the 555th, they ignited something else. A quiet revolution of capability, of proof, that black soldiers could do anything asked of them and more. That when given the chance, they wouldn't just match expectations, they'd obliterate them. And all of it, every single act of courage was done without applause. No headlines, no press conferences, just smoke, fire, and men falling from the sky. That's the story of the 555th. That's the story Japan never expected. And that's the story America almost forgot. But the forest remembers. The old growths in Oregon, the high ridgelines of Northern California, the deep, pine-choked valleys of Idaho, those places remember the sound of boots hitting earth, of blades cutting fire lines into soil, of human breath panting through smoke and soot. They remember the 555th, even if the nation didn't. Because legacy isn't always built in daylight. Sometimes, it's carved in silence. Sometimes it's a man, covered in ash, ribs cracked from a hard landing, still swinging a Pulaski to keep the fire from leaping the line. Sometimes, it's a platoon of soldiers who were told they weren't good enough, weren't strong enough, weren't American enough, and then proved they were more than anyone dared believe. They didn't wear capes. They didn't get monuments. But when the bombs floated down, when the balloons drifted in on invisible currents, armed with fire and wrapped in silence, these men stood ready. Parachutes packed, boots tight, orders sealed, No glory. No headlines. Just mission. And they took it. Every mission they completed was a contradiction in the face of American hypocrisy. They were warriors for a country that denied them rights. Heroes in uniforms stitched by a segregated system. And yet, when called, they didn't hesitate. That kind of loyalty, that kind of sacrifice, it shakes something loose in you. Because it means they weren't just brave, they were principled, grounded, fierce in the way only the overlooked can be. They weren't fighting for medals. They were fighting because the job had to be done. Because letting it burn wasn't an option. It still isn't. Today, smoke jumpers drop into wildfires from the same skies, using tools pioneered by the 555th. They follow the same principles: speed, precision, courage. They wear improved gear, deploy better tech, but the essence remains. And it all began with a group of black paratroopers no one expected to succeed. But they did. They carried a war few ever saw, fought enemies most didn't even know existed, and when the fires were out, they returned to a world unchanged. A world that still didn't see them, still didn't salute. But now we know. We know who the triple nickels were. We know what they did. We know that while bombs drifted silently from the edge of the world, while cities panicked in secret, and while flames tried to erase everything in their path, these men answered the call. The triple nickels weren't just soldiers. They were proof. Living, breathing defiance to every closed door and every sneer they'd ever faced in boot camp, in town, in the very country they were risking everything to defend. They knew what was waiting for them when the fire was out. They knew the world wouldn't change just because they fought back the flames. When they returned to base, they'd still be eating in separate mess halls, still marching past the same stairs, still being told they weren't ready for combat, even after they'd survived what most men couldn't imagine. But out there, in the smoke and the silence, none of that mattered. Because fire doesn't ask what color you are. It doesn't care what the country thinks of you. It only knows how to burn. And the 555th knew how to stop it. They forged a path no one else was willing to take, built a legacy no one thought to record. And though the newspapers stayed quiet, and the medals never came, something deeper remained etched into the land, into the forests they saved, into the lives they protected without ever being seen. They weren't supposed to be remembered, but they are, and they always will be. Because there's something sacred about doing the right thing when no one's watching. About rising above the hate, the doubt, the silence. About jumping straight into the fire not for glory, but because the fire was there, and someone had to stop it. So when the flames come again, and they always do, remember the first to meet them from the sky. Remember the black soldiers who fought a secret war with courage that didn't need applause. Remember the triple nickels. They were America's answer when silence fell from the sky. And they were everything this country claimed to be, even when it refused to see them.